Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third lecture for Human Motor Control and Learning. Before we get started with this review lecture, I just wanted to go over one last time the new process for the labs. Based on how everything is returning back to in-person, we've been advised by the faculty that the labs cannot be virtual. They have to return to in the laboratory, in person, you collecting the data yourself. Now, each lab, remember, runs for 2 weeks. And so on the syllabus, when it says week 1 and week 2, it's just the first week for your lab and then the second week for the same lab. The lab is always due before the start of the following lab, of the new lab. So for the 10th and 11th, you're going to go in person and complete lab 2. If you need the second week, you would show up for week 2 of that lab and finish it then. And then for all of you, the lab report will be due before the start of the following lab. So hopefully that makes sense and is clear for everyone. I've updated the syllabus, and again, like always, feel free to email me or message me on Canvas if you have any questions. We can talk more about it as well. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is it's a good time now to start going through what's expected of you for the assignment. Now, the assignment is looking at different motor skills and having you analyze them based on sort of the topics of each lecture. So for example, you're going to analyze a motor skill using Gentile's taxonomy, which was the first lecture. So it's really important, just so that way you get a mindset of what is expected or what is required for the assignment. It's all listed very clearly in the rubric, but the rubric, the assignment details are all posted on Canvas right now. And so by going through and reading what the assignment is, it'll allow you to at least keep it in the back of your mind. So when we're learning stuff in lecture, you'll be able to relate it to whatever motor skill you end up choosing. I know we had a baton twirler, so I'm sure that's going to come out in one of the assignments. People pick hockey, people pick jump shots, people pick different dance routines. Look into the assignment and then start developing an idea of what motor skill you would like to do, but also would be not easy, but doable, right? It can't be a very, very complicated task, but it should be complicated enough that you can answer all of the questions for the assignment in enough detail to get the marks. Carolyn's asking a question. Sorry, I haven't checked over, but are we allowed to have the same skill like duplicates? So no, we're not actually. But if you you can usually pick different, like, so a lot of people have done the same sport, but picked different parts of the same skill. So like soccer kicking. So dribbling a soccer ball or soccer kick or different aspects of the same sport. So it's important to pick quickly, because then when you confirm with your TA, they just write down what everyone's doing for their skill, you get first choice. So I was gonna set up like an Excel sheet where a sign up sheet, but now I wonder if we should do it in lab. I'll confirm it for next week. Fair? I just don't want to do too much and just freak people out. Yeah, I don't want to confuse everyone more than we already are. Can we all see the lecture slides? Perfect. So let me start off by saying that this lecture is simply just a review of Intro to Movement Neuroscience, and it is tested very little on the midterm. The breakdown of the midterm and how many questions are from each lecture will be listed, and there's a significant significantly less amount of questions from this lecture. So I'll point out the most important parts, but I just wanted everyone in the class to get up to speed in that our ability to perform the motor skill, the final output is our neuromuscular system. So we develop in our motor planning areas, the specific activation of our motor units that are required to achieve whatever skill we've decided that we wanted to do. This is the final output. And what a lot of the research has looked into is sort of the variables that are involved with us developing that motor plan accurately. So very briefly in today's lecture, we'll talk about sort of the different areas that are involved in the coordination of our body to achieve our motor skills. We'll talk about the functional unit of the nervous system, and then the peripheral and central nervous systems and how they sort of all work together. Is there any questions before we start off? Does anyone remember Intro to Movement Neuroscience? Did you like it? Did you find it interesting? Okay, awesome. So it's okay. That's great. That's great. Because remember, this class isn't a neuroscience heavy class, but it's nice to sort of remind yourself of how our body actually functions, right? The actual neuroanatomical and neurophysiological mechanism behind controlling our muscles. With looking at this class, it's how the different variables of the environment, the skill itself, and the person, how they work together to affect the output. So this is, remember, this neuromotor basis of movement is the final output. The research that we had looked at previously and after this lecture, the rest of the course, is looking at how different variables interact and affect our ability to produce that neuromotor control. So remember, our human nervous system is divided up into two main sections. We have our central nervous system, which counts as everything that's encased in bone. And then we have our peripheral nervous system. That would be everything outside of the vertebral column and the skull. So that would include all of the different spinal nerves exiting from each level of the vertebral column and how they recombine to create our sciatic nerve and radial nerve, musculocutaneous nerve, all the different peripheral nerves in our body. So it's through the coordination of the activation of our motor units that we're able to coordinate or control our voluntary movement, which is our ability to perform motor skills. The functional unit of our nervous system is the neuron. And so we had learned in neuroscience that there are a bunch of different cells that are involved in the neurological system, but the functional unit, the cell that's required or utilized to send electrical signals, is the neuron. Just like we have gravitational potential energy. If I lift something up and I drop it, it has like a quote unquote potential energy, in this case gravitational potential energy, because if I let go, it will fall. Our neuron is able to generate a concentration in an electrical gradient, or it develops a charge, so it develops electrical potential energy. And its ability to do that allows it to send that charge from its proximal end to its distal end down the axon. And that's functionally how the system works. There are main components of the neuron that are highly specialized to perform that action. We have the cell body of the neuron, which is called the soma. It produces neurotransmitters. So it is where you create and package up the neurotransmitters and then send them to the presynaptic terminals to be released in synaptic transmission. The axon is the output unit of the neuron, and that's where we have our voltage-gated ion channels that create the action potential. And then the dendrites act as the receiving site for the neuron. So it's either they have receptors or they have ligand or neurotransmitter binding receptors in the dendrites, and that will create local potentials that add up or summate. I don't know if you guys remember from the lectures, but they summate, and if there's enough of a potential, it will generate an action potential. So here we have the typical picture of a neuron. So these would be the dendrites or receiving sites, cell body, axon, this is where the action potential is generated, and then this is the presynaptic terminals. This is where all the neurotransmitters were released, and then flow across the synaptic cleft to in contact with another neuron or muscle membrane. Do you all remember the process of synaptic transmission? It just means that the neuron, when it connects to another neuron or another cell, there's a space in between, a synapse. And so the only way that it's able to send the action potential, it's not like electricity comes down here from the potential, action potential, and then jumps over to the next neuron. It has to reach the end of the neuron, and then neurotransmitters have to be released and then picked up by the other neuron to continue the transmission. So this is a rate limiting step because it takes much more time than the very, very quick action potential. And that's all you would really need to know for that slide. Again, this is just a review. Is that okay, Jacob? Awesome. Yay. It's through the process of summation where you have all of the local potentials being generated at the dendrites. Some of them are excitatory, some of them are inhibitory, but it's through that process that you say that the neuron is able to integrate information because it's taking stimuli from multiple inputs, probably of their different neurons or different receptors. So it's receiving information, integrating it through the form of summation, just the adding up of the electrical potentials or the local potentials. And if there's enough of a change, you would get your voltage-gated channels to open up or the generation of an action potential. The action potential is the transmission of information, and then the transfer of information from one neuron to another is through our previous slide, the synaptic cleft or the synaptic transmission. So the neurons themselves are an all or none response in terms of an action potential, but they integrate information through this summation process. It's not like it's a brain. It's not like calculating and conversing. It's simply just like the math addition of the electrical potentials, some being excitatory, some being inhibitory. And it's through like that mechanism that we're able to modulate the firing of different neurons. And so what was one thing that we were talking about when you're stressed that affects your ability to control your neuromuscular system? It may affect your ability to perform a motor skill that you're really good at. When you're stressed, you might not be able to perform as well. In part, maybe that's because of, you know, the effect of stress and how it leads to maybe altering the electrical potential in the neuron. This is just the diagram reviewing summation. So electrical potentials can add up spatially or temporally. And in actuality, it's both happening all the time. Now, we're most concerned in terms of our motor system, in terms of movement with our motor system. We've been talking about the output and signals getting sent down through the neurons and the activation of motor units to flex muscles. But remember, the first step, then we're going to learn this all through motor control, like this course, that the first step of being able to perform motor skill is the sensory process. And we're going to learn that as you become better and better and better at a motor skill that you're practicing, you're better able to understand the environment, to pick out what's most important. Like, for example, when they were looking at professional baseball players versus amateur baseball players, professional baseball players can focus more specifically on the ball when it's thrown. So they're better at timing their swing because they're better at picking up the ball that's thrown from the pitcher. So they're better at taking out or taking in what's important from the environment. And that's a sensory process. So there's two directions of flow of the neurons or the nerves in our body, the peripheral nerves, afferent and efferent. So afferent information is sensory neurons. So what type of senses, I'm going to try to keep relating it to motor skills, just so that way it's not so fully heavy neuroscience based, but what types of senses would be the most important to know or to take from when you're performing different motor skills? No right answer. You come up with different examples. Shared pain. Pain would maybe stop you from using a particular muscle. What do you, proprioception, yep. Sight, heat or cold, all of that, yep. So research has specifically or like consistently shown that when people are learning motor skills, vision is primary. We tend to, whatever we see supersedes our proprioception or sense of touch or a sense of hot and cold, like Jacob was saying. And they know this through the moving room experiments where they have the wall moving. So it makes it seem like you're moving, but you're not. Like how many people have been in a car and it starts moving forward? No, the car beside you is moving. And then so you think you see the side of your vision and then you freak out because you think that you're moving. Yes, it's because the vision's telling you you're moving when everything else in your body is telling you you're not moving. But vision for us supersedes everything. Carolyn was one time actually moving out. Down. You put your car in park at every stop sign or every red light. Oh, what are you talking? So that's an example of how vision is primary. We'll learn through the course that as you become better and better at a motor skill, you can rely less on vision and more on proprioception, which most of you have already sort of kind of figured out or instinctively thought about or intuitively figured out, but that's what research has shown, obviously. Our efferent axons are the motor neurons. So this is where we're having information or the actual action potentials moving from the spinal cord out to the muscles to flex. Nope. Proprioception is based on muscle spindles and joint receptors and Golgi tendon organs. Vision is based on the eyes. Like proprioception, I can like know which way I'm moving. It's a sense. Oh, balance, yeah, okay. You'll be okay. I believe in you, Karen. One of the things I wanted you all to remember is that the main sensory neurons that we have in our body are what's called pseudo-unipolar cells. So if we look at this pseudo-unipolar cell or a picture of one, we can see how the cell body is off to the side. Do you remember why our neuron was built that way? It's to maximize the speed of the action potential. Because we always have to be aware of our sensory processes before we can, modify our action plan or motor plan for that instance. That's why we need our sensory system to be so fast. So by having a pseudo-unipolar cell, instead of like it in the middle, this speeds up the action potential. And the location of all of our cell bodies of our sensory cells is in the dorsal root ganglion. So it's coming in the back end of the spinal cord, which is right there. Everyone okay? Awesome. Again, just a review. We're doing great. Our next neurons are our motor neurons. The motor neurons are efferent neurons. Information is going away from the midline or going out to the periphery. Our main motor neurons are our alpha motor neurons. These functionally create the motor unit. So the motor neurons are exiting from the spinal cord, and they attach to only a certain number of muscle fibers. So the generation of, or the activation of one motor unit is an all or none response, where that action potential will contract all of the muscle fibers that are associated with that motor neuron. So if we're going to regulate control of our muscles, it doesn't happen at the spinal cord level once it's already exited out. That's an all or none response. So once it's left, so there's obviously a lot of integration in the spinal cord. But once that signal has left the spinal cord, and once that action potential has left and it's now being generated down the motor unit, it's already an all or none response. The gamma motor neurons are important because they're sensory neurons. There are sensory neurons for proprioceptors, I think like Karen was saying, in our muscles. So does anyone remember what muscle spindles were? Muscle spindles it looks like this. They're actually a lot smaller than that, but they detect the change of length of the muscle fibers. So when we contract or lengthen our muscles, we have our muscle spindles that are sending information in the form of sensory information up to the spinal cord and brain. So when we were talking about proprioception, the way we're able to do that is primarily through the muscle spindles. They're sort of like strings. And so what has to happen is that if we flex our muscles, we also at the same time have to flex the muscle spindles, or else they become loose and floppy and they can't register length change. So when we activate our motor neurons, we also at the same time activate the gamma motor neurons associated with that alpha motor neuron. So it just maintains the tension in the muscle spindles. As we get better and better at performing motor skills, we can rely more heavily on the information from our muscle spindles and other proprioceptive receptors versus vision. The alpha motor neuron and the motor unit and the muscle fibers attached to the motor unit. That alpha motor neuron is also called the lower motor neuron. So the upper motor neurons are starting off in our motor planning areas. The lower motor neurons are starting off the spinal cord and then exiting out and attaching to the muscle fibers. Now, I don't know if you all remember this, but the point of the ability of our neurological system to process and be able to do such amounts or process so much information and be able to do so many things at once is through the multiple number of connections that we have. And the basic stat for our neurological system is that for every one sensory neuron, we have 10 motor neurons and 200,000 inner neurons. So the inner neurons are in between sensory and motor neurons, or in between motor and motor neurons, and they just allow for relaying the signal to different areas. So if you look at the ratio, look how much significantly more inner neurons we have. That means signals are constantly being sent all over the place and interacting with other parts of the neurological system. And it's through this number of pathways, because there's so many connections, that we're able to process so much information. Exactly like cable splitters. So it's like I'm sending information from my PS5 to the TV because the output, but imagine 200,000. It's like now I can go to 200,000 different TVs, or one's going to go to the audio system. One's going to go, I don't even know. everywhere else. And then that connection leads to another 10 connections, and other connections. And so it's so many different multiple connections that affect each other. That's how our neurological system is able to do so much. So that would be an example of interneuron. Is everyone okay? Not stressing anyone out? It's just a review. Stellar. Oh, nice. Good job, Jacob. So of the central nervous system, we're going to talk about the parts that are most specific to control of movement, obviously, just based on the topic of the course. Here we have our cerebrum, and this is the brainstem. The spinal cord is below the brainstem. The cerebellum right here, so this is posterior, this is anterior. This is actually where we store and learn our motor programs. And we're going to be talking about that next class. So if you look at the folds of the cerebellum versus the folds of the cerebrum, do you see how the folds are so much tighter in the cerebellum? It allows for increased surface area. So more than half of the neurons in the central nervous system are in the cerebellum because of the fact that the folds are so tightly put together, it can hold more. And this is important because this is where we store all of our coordination for our motor programs. Remember that the cerebrum is divided into two halves or two hemispheres. Do you remember the central sulcus? So there's the different lobes, each for a different part. Our motor planning areas are located just anterior to the parietal lobe. We make a decision that we want to move in the prefrontal cortex, and then that information is sort of processed by the motor planning areas and put into the checklist of which neurons to fire or which motor units to fire. The reason why the central sulcus is important, so this is a sort of anatomical landmark in the cerebrum, so it's a line that runs through here, is it because it signifies the beginning of our motor area versus our sensory area. Our main motor planning areas are the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, and the supplementary motor cortex. So when I decide I want to complete a task, specifically a task that I haven't done before, okay? I see what's around me, and then I make a decision in my prefrontal lobe that this is what I want to do. I want to pick up this new object. I don't even know what it is. The motor planning areas, think about it as three different processing areas. It's this area or these three areas here that are going to Is everyone okay? Power went out. I'm just hotspotting from my my phone. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. But it is what it is. Okay. So let's continue. So think of the motor planning areas as the different areas in the brain that are going to piece together or determine which motor units to fire. So think of it like creating the checklist of the following muscles that are required for the activity we've decided to do. The primary motor cortex is going to be involved in the initiation and coordination of movement for fine motor skills. So this will be the final pathway of what specific movements or what motor units are required for fine control. Our premotor cortex is going to be involved in figuring out what core muscles we need to activate so we maintain stability while we're performing the motor skill. And then the supplementary motor cortex is going to be important in figuring out how to coordinate the movements of both of our hands at once, and also consider, the movements that are coming in sequence. So if I'm going to be pitching, I'm going to be moving from one leg to another as I throw. That's going to have to adjust the way that I choose to affect my muscles or which motor units to affect. So the working of the three areas are important in creating the checklist of which muscles are going to be utilized. Does that make sense, everyone? There's a good chance that I think it's only Karen and Sabanki on here. No one else is responding. Man, oops, no, it's okay. The basal ganglia is involved in that, looking at that sort of checklist that the motor planning areas have created and making sure that the movement is smooth. And so what the basal ganglia is involved in, and remember, it is a bunch of, or a collection of bodies of neurons that work at regulating the force of the muscles. So what it's going to do is look at the checklist of the muscles we want to activate, and that list will be made by the motor planning areas, and it's going to adjust by how much each muscle is activated, ensure that the movement is smooth. And we know this through Parkinson's disease, which affects the basal ganglia. We can look at the symptoms of Parkinson's disease and then get a better idea of what the basal ganglia is actually involved in. I have a video there if you guys neuroscience. The most important, they're all very important, but one important part, if not the most important part of the central nervous system for the purposes of this course is the cerebellum. And so I'm not sure if you all remember sort of how the cerebellum works, but we have the two different tracks. I think it was a Josephine or someone was already having PTSD from memorizing all of the tracks in the spinal cord. Do you remember the different internal feedback and high fidelity tracks? It was Kayla. So Kayla, do you remember them? These are the unconscious relay pathways to back up to the cerebellum. So the internal feedback tracks, you know how we were just talking about interneurons? Every time I've decided to flex a muscle, I have created that that checklist in the motor planning areas. It's regulated by the basal ganglia and then sent down to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, it goes out to the lower motor neurons and then ultimately out to the muscles. Once it goes from upper motor neuron to lower motor neuron, there's an interneuron that sends that back up through the internal feedback tracks up to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is aware of what muscles we're contracting, okay? What else is being sent to the cerebellum are all of the information from our muscle spindles. So all of our proprioceptive tracts are being sent back up to the cerebellum as well. So the cerebellum is constantly comparing what muscles we're contracting versus how our body is moving. Motor output versus proprioception. And it's through, so think about all this. So what was a process of learning? What did we observe is the process of learning? We all said repetition, trying over and over and over again. So the reason why that is because with every repetition, we get potentially closer to our goal. We compare which muscles we used and in which order and how close we were to, or how our body moved and how close we were to achieving the skill. And every time it's a little bit better, our cerebellum is remembering the order in which we connected our muscles. So the cerebellum isn't affecting how much force we put into our muscles, it's affecting coordination. It's basically remembering the timing, rhythm, and synchronization of our movements. So as we get better and better at a motor skill through the process of learning or repetition, we become more coordinated. Our muscles and our body is moving in a more efficient manner. That's as a result of the cerebellum recognizing the right synchronous activation of the muscles for that motor skill. Now think of all the different motor skills that we are really good at. All of that information has to be stored in the cerebellum. And so for next lecture, when we talk about motor programs, now you can now remember that this is where that's getting stored. I was going to make a joke, but it's just through different imaging studies. So through like TMS studies, they would activate the cerebellum and like, so you use the magnetic energy and you disrupt the cerebellum, and then you would have people learning a motor skill. Once they did that, the subjects that had the cerebellum disrupted wouldn't learn. Yeah. Weird, right? But that's how it works. That's why we have to learn through repetition. And so I know in the Matrix, when I don't know if you guys remember that movie, but in the Matrix, when you download a motor program, you're like, I know Kung Fu. It can't really happen that way. It's through the process of repetition. What we can do though is we can maximize the types of trials and the types of practice that we do to optimize the number of repetitions we need to get, good at something. The brainstem is evolutionarily older, so it contains our medulla, which is our regulatory center for physiological purposes or physiologic processes, heart rate, breathing rate, body temperature, vomiting, that sort of stuff. The pons is what connects the cerebellum to the cerebrum. And the thalamus is just the relay center for everything going in and out of the brain needs to run through the thalamus. The last couple of slides, I just wanted to go over the spinal cord because in relation to the course, motor control, remember we were talking about the difference between a reflex and a skill. Whereas like a blink, because of something that's in my eye, is a reflex, whereas I'm winking at someone, that's a motor skill because I'm consciously doing it. The movement that occurs as a result of reflexes occurs through connections with inner neurons in the spinal cord. I'm not sure how much you remember, but this is a cross-section of the spinal cord. All the sensory information comes in through the back. So this would be all of our pseudo-unipolar neurons. There's a dorsal ganglion. Here, the afferent or ventral root is our motor information exiting. So this would be the lower motor neuron, and it's going to be connecting out to whichever muscle fibers are associated with that motor unit. There's an order in how the muscles are organized in the anterior root. Flexor muscles are distal, extensor muscles are more anterior, distal, lateral, proximal are medial. No need to know that. And then, sorry, Kayla. These are all the different tracks. We had our sensory tracks, and they were all sort of groupings of the types of sensory information. So we had our dorsal column, which was fine touch proprioception of vibration. That would be sensory neurons that are coming up through the back end, the very, very dorsal. We had our spinal thalamic tract that was for pain and temperature. It is the dorsal column. That is the spinal thalamic tract, and both of these ended up in our primary somatosensory area. We had our spinal cerebellar tracts. That was what we just talked about, the internal feedback and high fidelity tracts. Those are unconscious because they go into the cerebellum. Anything that we have to perceive goes through the cerebrum. If it goes just to the cerebellum, we're unconscious of it. And then we had our motor tracts. That was motor information coming from the brain or the motor planning areas out to the lower motor neurons. We had our medial upper motor neuron tracts, which were responsible for core and posture information, or core and posture muscles. And then we had our lateral upper motor neuron tracts, specifically the lateral corticospinal, which is the most important, and that's for fine control. So in terms of motor skills, obviously all of the tracts are important, but fine control, our ability to do intricate movements, is going to be our lateral corticospinal tract. And that's when we look at the tracts, look at the size difference with the lateral corticospinal tract versus the other motor tracts. It's so much bigger. So many more connections. Oops. Here's just a slide reiterating the motor unit and how it's an all-or-none response. And then I did want to bring up this, sort of the recruitment of motor units. I don't think there's any track questions. I think I just was reviewing it so you're just aware. Yeah. Kayla has to memorize it. No, Karen. So I just wanted to finish off on one thing. Do we all remember Henneman's size principle? So for every muscle, there's a large number of motor units, and we activate a muscle by more or less based on how many motor. So let's say we want to go and activate it at 100%, we would activate 100% of the motor units. If we wanted to activate it at 50%, we would activate 50% of the motor units. That's going to be decided from the motor planning areas. Once it's out, it's already been decided. It's an all-in-one response. My research, one interesting thing that I wanted to just tell you guys hot off the press, is that I'm looking at when we have chronic pain, the order in which we activate our motor units, we're supposed to go from small to large, it changes. And I think it's because when you are activating your muscle, you don't want the co-contraction because it adds to the tension in your joints wherever you have chronic pain. It jumps and goes right to the bigger muscles for movement. Super strange. But with treatment, I'm showing that it temporarily resets the recruitment of our motor units. Yeah. So there's different ones. So the one in one of the research that I'm doing cervical manipulation, so I'm funded by the Canadian Chiropractic Association. The other one we're looking at acupuncture, and it's basically the treatments that are going to help. It's when you have like a bombardment of sensory information, having all of the sensory information come back. So with adjustments, you're stretching the joint receptors and muscle spindles and stuff. All of that sensory information happening at once tends to reset the spinal cord. So this is not anything related to the course at all. This is just my research. So if you look at chronic pain, the orderly recruitment of our motor units that typically would happen, dictated by Henneman's size principle, it is altered. And so neurologically, with certain treatments, you can show that Henneman's size principle, which was altered in chronic pain, resets temporarily. Depends on the treatment. It's usually about 20 minutes. But if you have that window, right? So what with the rehab treatments, you always do the treatment and then you have them do exercises. I can prove why that's important to do, because you have that window where everything's sort of reset a little bit. So it's important to redo the motor program in that space. And then technically the program would last longer. Yeah, super cool. Yeah, exactly. So understanding how we activate our neuromotor system to, move the body in the way that we want to is very important, obviously. But there's also a difference, and I wanted to bring up this slide, from intent to action. So remember we talked about MEG, those like MEG machines, like last lecture? How it was measuring the actual muscle, the electrical activity. So figuring out how to activate our motor units to do an action is only one part of the issue. If I was to do, and they had this one study by Carson and Kelso, they had some where they had to tap, because remember it's a big MEG machine, they had to tap their finger on and off beat. So let's say it was metronome, tick, 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 tick. And so they had to tap their finger to the beat, versus they had another group that had to tap their finger off beat. So tick, tick. Oh, that was good. So tick, 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 the opposite. And they measured what part of the brain areas were active, and it was different. So even though it should be the same, you're flexing your finger, that the activation, the motor planning areas, everything should be similar, because you're going different from perceiving on beat versus off beat. It changes, the motor planning areas, the intent. So that's why MEG machines are so important, because looking at what muscles to activate is just one part of the process. We have to look at how cognitively all of the sensory information we're taking in is processed together. It's right here. Please tell me I'm sharing my screen. Awesome. Yeah, I did not do very well. But do we have any questions about the review lecture, everyone? Again, it was just a basic overview of the neuroscience course, just so that way we have it in mind when we start going through how different environmental, internal, and skill variables affect our ability to perform motor skills. No questions? Okay, awesome. Let me stop recording.